When Anne of Brittany was born in 1477, no one could have guessed how quickly the weight of a nation would fall upon her small shoulders. She entered the world not as a princess of France, nor as a mere noble child, but as the heir to one of the last great independent duchies in Europe. Brittany had long resisted absorption into the Kingdom of France. Its dukes ruled with relative independence, protected by tradition, alliances, and the pride of a Celtic people determined to preserve their identity. Her father, Duke Francis II, understood how fragile Brittany's survival had become. France was growing stronger by the year, while neighboring powers, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, looked on with hungry eyes. He sought to safeguard his duchy through diplomacy and treaties, but when he died suddenly in 1488, his little daughter was only 11 years old. And in that moment, the fate of Brittany shifted violently. Anne became duchess at an age when most girls were still learning to embroider or recite prayers. Instead of a childhood, she inherited a crown and the relentless gaze of Europe's most ambitious rulers. France immediately moved to assert dominance, declaring her guardianship under their supervision. But others saw opportunity. To the Habsburgs, to the English, and to smaller courts across Europe, the hand of the young duchess was not just a marriage prospect. It was the key to claiming her duchy itself. Anne's court scrambled to protect her. Advisors arranged a marriage by proxy to Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor. It was a bold, desperate move, designed to align Brittany with one of the strongest dynasties in Europe. The ceremony was held hastily, without the groom even present. Maximilian's representatives placed a ring on Anne's finger, and she was declared his wife in the eyes of God and law. On paper, Brittany had found its protector, but paper meant little against armies. The French king, Charles V, refused to tolerate the union. To him, the proxy marriage was a direct insult, a threat planted on his doorstep. He marched his forces into Brittany, determined to break the alliance and claim the duchy for France. By 1491, French troops surrounded the city of Rennes, where Anne had taken refuge. Inside the walls, the young duchess endured her first true siege. She was barely a teenager, yet she bore the responsibility of defending her people against one of the strongest kings in Europe. Chroniclers describe her as solemn, dressed in black, often visible on the ramparts, trying to project strength. But starvation and despair crept through the city. The defenders knew the truth. They could not hold out forever. When Rennes finally capitulated, Anne's fate was sealed. The proxy marriage to Maximilian was annulled by force, and Charles V demanded her hand in marriage. She was only 14 years old when the negotiations concluded, and the ceremony was conducted with grim haste. The Duchess of Brittany was now Queen of France, not by choice, but by conquest. The wedding itself carried the atmosphere of political theater rather than celebration. Anne entered the church flanked by French guards, her gown heavy with embroidery, but her expression subdued. To many observers, the marriage was less a union than a submission ritual, the symbolic annexation of Brittany through the body of its young duchess. That night, she was led to the royal bedchamber, a girl forced into the role of a queen and wife to a king she had not chosen. Chronicles of the time are discreet about what followed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. France had claimed not just her duchy, but her person. The Virgin Duchess was no more. The Queen of France was born in sorrow. Anne's first years at the French court were marked by isolation and grief. She was surrounded by unfamiliar customs, cut off from her Breton advisors, and constantly reminded that she was no longer free. Yet even in captivity, she displayed resilience. When Charles embarked on his Italian campaigns, leaving her in charge of state matters, she governed with a maturity beyond her years. Though her authority was limited, it was the beginning of her transformation, from pawn to player. Tragedy soon shadowed her personal life. Anne endured a series of pregnancies, most of which ended in stillbirth or the death of the child soon after birth. Each loss was a public reminder of her role as a vessel for dynastic survival, and each failure was a private wound. Court records hint at her sorrow, but also at her determination to fulfill her duty despite unrelenting pressure. Yet within this painful initiation into queenship lay the seeds of her strength. She had entered marriage as a captive duchess, but experience was teaching her how power operated, how negotiations were framed, and how survival required patience as much as resistance. By the mid-1490s, Anne of Brittany was no longer just the child duchess thrown into a storm. She was a woman who had endured siege, forced marriage, and repeated grief, yet who still carried herself with quiet dignity. The girl who had once stood on the ramparts of Rennes was learning that captivity did not mean silence, and that her story was far from over. The year 1498 changed everything for Anne of Brittany. On a spring day in Amboise, King Charles VIII struck his head on a low doorway and died suddenly at the age of 27. For Anne, the moment was both a liberation and a crisis. After 7 years of a coerced marriage, she was once again a widow, and once again the most sought-after heiress in Europe. Protocol required her to leave the French court and return to Brittany. She departed with quiet determination, not as the frightened child of Rennes, but as a woman who had learned how to endure captivity and loss. Back in Nantes, her duchy welcomed her with the reverence due to their sovereign. For a fleeting moment, she was free, able to govern, to restore her Breton advisors, and to dream of marrying on her own terms. But freedom, as Anne well knew, was fragile. The new King of France, Louis XV, had ambitions that reached directly into Brittany. Louis was already married to Joan of France, a deeply pious and physically frail woman. Yet within weeks of his accession, he began maneuvering for an annulment. The king wanted Anne, and with her, Brittany. This time, however, the Duchess was prepared. No longer the child trapped in Rennes, she entered the negotiations with a clear strategy. She would not allow Brittany to be swallowed silently. If she was to be forced into another marriage, it would be on terms of her own making. The annulment of Joan was cruelly public. Joan, daughter of Louis XV, had been married to Louis XV for decades despite her ill health. She resisted the annulment with dignity, but the church, pressured by royal power, ruled in Louis's favor. Anne, watching from Brittany, understood the brutality of dynastic politics. Wives were set aside like broken vessels when alliances demanded it. When the proposal for marriage reached her, she did not simply accept. She demanded concessions. Brittany would retain its separate institutions. Her coronation as queen would include recognition of her duchess title. Her children would inherit rights not just to France, but to Brittany itself. She would control her dowry lands, and her household would be staffed with her loyal Bretons. In an age when queens were expected to yield, Anne forced a king to bargain. Her marriage to Louis XV, solemnized in 1499, was not the same act of submission she had endured with Charles. It was, in its own way, a treaty. Life with Louis XV was different as well. He treated her with respect, perhaps even affection, and granted her more political space than Charles ever had. She established her own court, filled with poets, artists, and humanists. Under her patronage, illuminated manuscripts flourished, music was composed, and Breton traditions were celebrated. Far from being a passive figure, Anne became a cultural architect, using art and ceremony to reinforce both her ducal and royal identities. Yet the shadow of motherhood still dominated her existence. Between 1499 and 1508, she endured at least a dozen pregnancies, most ending in miscarriages or the death of infants. Each time, the court waited breathlessly for a male heir who never survived. Each time Anne grieved quietly, gathering herself for the next ordeal. In 1501, however, a glimmer of hope arrived. Anne gave birth to a healthy daughter, Claude. For a brief moment, the court rejoiced, though whispers soon reminded everyone that a girl was not the heir France desperately needed. Still, for Anne, Claude was more than a dynastic pawn. She was her mother's comfort, a bond that would become central to Anne's final years. The constant cycle of pregnancies and losses etched itself into Anne's demeanor. Observers noted her seriousness, her gravity, the sense that joy was fleeting and duty eternal. Yet even in her grief, she maintained her poise and authority. She traveled tirelessly between Brittany and France, ensuring that her duchy remained visible, its independence still asserted through her presence. Anne's negotiations extended beyond the personal. She sought to secure Claude's future with the same determination that had defined her own survival. As early as 1501, she resisted attempts to betroth her daughter to foreign princes, wary of repeating the mistakes that had endangered Brittany. Instead, she maneuvered carefully within France, ensuring that Claude's eventual marriage would protect, rather than erase, her inheritance. Her resilience impressed even those who opposed her. To many in Europe, Anne of Brittany was no longer a pawn, but a strategist, one of the few women of her age who managed to wield real influence without a throne of her own. She could not prevent tragedy, but she could shape politics. Behind closed doors, however, the toll was immense. Letters hint at her exhaustion, her prayers for strength, her reliance on faith to endure repeated loss. And yet, she never allowed her private sorrow to eclipse her public role. At festivals, she appeared in magnificent gowns embroidered with ermine, the symbol of Brittany's endurance. At ceremonies, she carried herself with the dignity of a ruler who represented not only France's queen, but Brittany's duchess. By the first decade of the 16th century, Anne had achieved something remarkable. She had been forced into marriage twice, used as a vessel for dynastic ambitions, and crushed under the weight of expectation. And yet she had carved out a space of resistance. She had preserved Brittany's identity, elevated its culture, and ensured that her daughter Claude would inherit more than just her grief. Anne's story in these years was one of contradictions, captivity and control, loss and resilience, sorrow and triumph. She had learned that survival was not found in rebellion, which would be crushed, but in negotiation, turning chains into terms and duty into leverage. Her final years, however, would test her more severely than ever before. Illness, exhaustion, and the relentless demands of politics pressed upon her. And yet, even in decline, she remained determined to shape the future. Through her daughter, through her duchy, and through the legacy of a queen who refused to vanish into silence. By the second decade of the 16th century, Anne of Brittany was no longer the fragile bride dragged into a coerced marriage. She was a seasoned queen, a mother, and a duchess whose strength had been forged through years of grief and negotiation. Yet time, illness, and unrelenting duty were wearing her down. Her body bore the scars of more than a dozen pregnancies. Chronic ailments plagued her: kidney stones, fevers, and relentless exhaustion. Physicians of the age prescribed herbal infusions and long pilgrimages, but nothing could restore her vitality. Observers noted her stooped posture, her weary face, and the quiet determination that still burned in her dark eyes. Despite her failing health, Anne pressed forward with the duties of state. She continued to travel between Brittany and the French court, refusing to let her duchy slip into obscurity. In Nantes, she held audiences with Breton nobles, reaffirming their privileges and strengthening the duchy's institutions. In Paris, she performed the ceremonial role of queen with dignity, her gowns glittering with embroidery of ermine tails, the eternal emblem of Brittany's endurance. Her greatest concern was her daughter, Claude. By 1506, it was clear that Anne would not provide France with a surviving male heir. Louis XV began to consider the succession carefully, aware that without a son, the crown would pass to his cousin Francis, Duke of Angoulême. To secure stability, Louis proposed a marriage between Francis and Claude, a union that would consolidate the French throne but inevitably weaken Brittany's independence. For Anne, this was an unbearable compromise. She had fought her entire life to preserve Brittany's autonomy. To hand Claude to Francis was, in her eyes, to surrender the duchy once and for all. She resisted fiercely, exploring alternative alliances with foreign princes who might safeguard Brittany's separate identity. But the political tide was against her. France, hungry for consolidation, would not allow Brittany to slip away. Her resistance, however, was not in vain. By demanding terms and delaying agreements, she managed to preserve Brittany's distinct legal and cultural traditions, at least symbolically, even as Claude's future was tied more tightly to France. In this way, Anne's negotiations ensured that Brittany's spirit would outlast its political independence. Meanwhile, her patronage of the arts reached its zenith. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts such as the Grande Heure d'Anne de Bretagne, a prayer book whose intricate illustrations remain among the treasures of French Renaissance art. The pages depict not just biblical scenes but also the landscapes, flora, and fauna of Brittany itself, a subtle act of embedding her duchy into the spiritual and cultural life of Europe. Through music, architecture, and literature, she created a court that reflected both her Breton heritage and her role as Queen of France. She surrounded herself with poets and musicians, ensuring that her name would be remembered not only in treaties and chronicles, but in songs and prayers. In an age when women's voices were often silenced, Anne carved her memory into parchment and stone, yet privately, sorrow lingered. The death of children had become a rhythm of her life, and though she bore it with dignity, the grief weighed heavily. Letters from those around her speak of a woman whose faith was deep, whose prayers were fervent, and whose endurance seemed almost superhuman. Still, she could not escape the sense that her body, once the vessel of dynastic hope, had betrayed her ambitions. By 1513, Anne's health had worsened dramatically. Confined more often to her chambers, she leaned on her daughter for comfort and on her faith for strength. In January 1514, at the age of 36, Anne of Brittany died in Blois. The court plunged into mourning. Chroniclers describe the grief as profound, for though she had often been a symbol of resistance and sorrow, she was also beloved for her dignity and generosity. Her funeral was conducted with extraordinary ceremony. In a gesture that shocked contemporaries, her heart was placed in a golden reliquary and sent to Brittany, where it was enshrined in Nantes. The symbolism was unmistakable. Her body may have served France, but her heart belonged eternally to her duchy. Louis XIII, devastated, remarried quickly in hopes of producing a male heir. His bride was the young Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII of England. But Louis died within months, and the crown passed to Francis I, the very man Anne had struggled to prevent from absorbing her daughter's inheritance. In 1514, Claude married Francis, and with her, Brittany moved inexorably closer to permanent union with France. And yet, Anne's legacy could not be erased. Though Brittany would eventually lose its independence in 1532, the memory of Anne of Brittany endured as a symbol of resistance, dignity, and cultural pride. To Bretons, she remained their duchess, the woman who fought for their autonomy even from within the gilded prison of queenship. To France, she was remembered as the twice-crowned queen, a rare figure who had married two kings and left behind a cultural renaissance. Her story resonates not because she triumphed in the conventional sense. Brittany was absorbed, her children mostly lost, her body worn down, but because she transformed powerlessness into agency. Forced into marriage, she turned it into a treaty. Stripped of choices, she carved out space to maneuver. Surrounded by loss, she created beauty that outlived her. Anne of Brittany reminds us that history is not only shaped by conquerors and kings. Sometimes it is shaped by women who endure, who negotiate, who refuse to be forgotten. Her heart, preserved in gold, still whispers across the centuries, a testament to duty, resilience, and the unyielding love of a duchess for her land. Even today, in Nantes, the reliquary of her heart stands as one of France's most poignant relics. Visitors pause before it, struck by the strange intimacy of a queen who gave her life to one kingdom, but her love to another. It is a reminder that history is not just about power, but about belonging, about the fragile, stubborn hope that even in captivity, one can still leave a mark of freedom. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want to discover even more hidden stories, don't forget to give this video a like. It truly helps support the channel. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our next story. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can continue exploring the mysteries, lessons, and forgotten tales of the past.